It was a quiet Sunday morning in the small town of Oakwood, tucked away in the heart of the American Midwest. The streets were still damp from a light rain that had passed through during the night, and the air smelled fresh, crisp, and cool. People walked slowly towards the Oakwood Baptist Church, their Sunday best clothes glistening under the weak sunlight. The service had already begun, and the congregation was filling the pews in preparation for another day of worship. But none of them could have anticipated the horror that was about to unfold. Inside the church, Pastor Nathaniel West stood at the pulpit, his voice warm and comforting as he led the morning prayers. His wife, Sarah West, sat in the front row, beaming with pride as she listened to her husband's words. They had been married for over 15 years, a couple that appeared perfect to the outside world, happy, dedicated to their faith, and deeply committed to the Oakwood community. But Nathaniel West had a secret that only a few knew, and that only one person, now standing in the back of the church, was about to expose in the most tragic way. As the congregation stood to sing a hymn, a man in a dark hoodie, his face hidden beneath the hood, entered the church. He moved quickly and silently, blending into the shadows. He made his way to the back of the church, his eyes locked on Pastor Nathaniel. Sarah, sitting unaware in the front row, smiled as she glanced at her husband. She had no idea what was about to happen. The man stepped forward, then suddenly the church was filled with a deafening bang. Pastor Nathaniel's body jolted violently, and he fell to the ground, his blood pooling around him in an instant. Screams erupted from the congregation as the scene descended into chaos. Sarah's face went pale as she saw her husband's lifeless form lying at the altar. The shooter, still hooded, stood motionless for a few moments before slowly turning and walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the now silent church. The doors slammed shut behind him, leaving nothing but panic and fear in his wake. The police were called immediately, and within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. The church was sealed off, and the investigation began. The victim's wife, Sarah, was in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The congregation members were questioned, but no one seemed to have any clue who the shooter was or what his motives might have been. Detective Allison Reynolds was called to lead the investigation. She was known for her sharp instincts and calm demeanor under pressure. As she walked into the church, she surveyed the scene, her eyes scanning for any clues that could explain what had just taken place. The altar was stained with blood, and the air was thick with fear. She took a deep breath, knowing that this would be no ordinary case. Who would want to kill Pastor Nathaniel? She muttered to herself. But as she looked at his wife, Sarah, sitting in the front row, she had a growing sense that there was more to this murder than met the eye. It didn't feel random. This was personal. Reynolds knew this case would be a challenge. Pastor Nathaniel's life, from the outside, appeared perfect. He was a well-respected man in the community, a loving husband, and a dedicated pastor. But Detective Reynolds could already sense that there were hidden layers to this story. She was about to uncover the dark secrets that had been concealed for years, and they would lead her down a path of betrayal, lies, and ultimately, murder. The hunt for answers had just begun, and Detective Reynolds was determined to find the truth, no matter how deeply buried it was. Detective Allison Reynolds sat in her office late that night, surrounded by piles of notes, witness statements, and evidence gathered from the scene of Pastor Nathaniel West's murder. The case weighed heavily on her mind. What had seemed like a straightforward murder had quickly spiraled into something much more complex. Pastor Nathaniel's death was not just a random act of violence. It had all the hallmarks of something deeply personal. The shooting in the church had been shocking enough, but as Reynolds reviewed the details, she began to piece together a darker picture. Pastor Nathaniel had been well-liked, beloved even, in the community. But as she dug deeper, she started to wonder if everyone had been fooled by the facade of his perfect life. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her office door. "Come in," she called, not looking up from the papers. It was Officer Jenkins, a young but sharp officer who had been with the Oakwood Police Department for a few years. He walked in, carrying a folder in his hands. "Detective Reynolds, we found. Something that might be relevant," he said, setting the folder down on her desk. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Jenkins opened the folder, revealing a series of photos and documents. The first page was a set of phone records. The records showed frequent late-night calls between Pastor Nathaniel West and a number that didn't match any known church members. A quick glance through the rest of the folder confirmed what Reynolds had begun to suspect. Pastor Nathaniel had been having an affair. The number on the phone records belonged to a man named Samuel Lawson, a name that seemed vaguely familiar to Reynolds. She quickly pulled up his details on her computer. Samuel Lawson was in his mid-30s, a man with no criminal record, but his background was anything but ordinary. Lawson had been a parishioner at Oakwood Baptist Church for several years, but recently there had been whispers about him. A young man with an odd intensity in his gaze, someone who kept to himself but was often seen around the church when Pastor Nathaniel was alone. Reynolds paused as she stared at the photo of Lawson, a stark contrast to the polished image of Pastor Nathaniel. Lawson was not married, had no known family in town, and seemed to live a solitary life. He had been coming to the church for the last year, but there was little information about his personal life. There was, however, one detail that stood out. The last phone call between Pastor Nathaniel and Samuel Lawson had been just hours before the shooting. The call had lasted for over 20 minutes, long enough for something to be said. Reynolds stood up from her desk, her mind racing. She needed to know more about Samuel Lawson. She needed to speak to him. "Get me everything you can on Samuel Lawson," she ordered Jenkins. "I want to know where he is, who he's been in contact with, and if there's anyone who can verify his whereabouts this morning." "On it, Detective," Jenkins responded, already heading out the door. Reynolds sat back down, feeling a surge of determination. She had a gut feeling that Samuel Lawson was the key to understanding what had happened that morning. The affair was the first clue, but something told her it was more than just a lover's quarrel gone wrong. As she reviewed the phone records one more time, another detail caught her attention. There was a final call between Nathaniel West and Lawson on the night before the murder, a call that ended abruptly. This was it, the turning point. There was something Nathaniel had said to Samuel that had pushed him over the edge. Reynolds just had to figure out what that was. The next morning, Reynolds arrived at Oakwood's police station early, her mind fixed on Samuel Lawson. She was eager to track him down and figure out what had transpired in the days leading up to the murder. Lawson had disappeared after the shooting, and no one seemed to have seen him since the tragedy unfolded in the church. Jenkins walked in with a new set of information. "I've tracked Lawson's last known movements," he said, handing over a piece of paper. "He was seen leaving town late last night, heading east on Highway 47. He was driving a black sedan, and witnesses reported seeing him at a gas station outside of town." Reynolds nodded. "We need to find him, Jenkins. He's our prime suspect, and I want to speak with him before he vanishes for good." By the time Reynolds arrived at the gas station where Lawson had been spotted, she was already several steps ahead. The clerk remembered the man well, describing him as unusually quiet, his eyes darting around nervously as he filled up his car. "Did he seem distressed?" Reynolds asked, her voice steady but probing. "He was sweating, kind of fidgety," the clerk replied. "He kept looking over his shoulder like he didn't want to be seen. That was it. Samuel Lawson was running, but he wasn't running from the law. He was running from something else." Reynolds had a hunch that it wasn't just about the murder. It was about something deeper, something that had been hidden for far too long. With a clear direction now, Reynolds ordered a roadblock on the highway, hoping to catch Lawson before he could get any further. As they waited for word of Lawson's whereabouts, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. She was about to uncover a love affair that had spiraled out of control, pushing someone to the edge. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized just how many lives had been shattered in the process. The chase for Samuel Lawson had begun. Detective Allison Reynolds had never liked the feeling of chasing someone. It wasn't the rush of the hunt that bothered her. It was the uncertainty, the fear of missing something important. And right now she felt the weight of that uncertainty, pressing down on her. Her team had set up roadblocks along Highway 47, the last known path Samuel Lawson had taken after the murder of Pastor Nathaniel West. With every minute that passed, Reynolds' anxiety grew. Lawson was likely heading to a remote area, somewhere far enough off the beaten path to escape notice. She couldn't afford to let him slip away. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone rang. It was Officer Jenkins, his voice crackling with urgency. "Detective, We found him. Lawson's car was spotted about 20 miles outside of Oakwood, parked by a small cabin near the woods. Reynolds felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They were getting close. "I'm on my way," she said, already grabbing her jacket and keys. "I want backup and to approach cautiously. We can't afford to take any chances." Within minutes, Reynolds and her team were speeding toward the location, her mind replaying everything she had learned about Samuel Lawson. The affair with Pastor Nathaniel, the strange behavior before the shooting, the mysterious phone calls. Nothing seemed to add up. Lawson had been a seemingly quiet man, a regular churchgoer who suddenly turned violent. Why? What had pushed him to murder Nathaniel in front of his wife and congregation? When they arrived at the cabin, the atmosphere was eerie. It was located far from the main road, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown shrubbery. The small, dilapidated structure appeared abandoned, but Reynolds could feel that something wasn't right. She motioned for her team to spread out, carefully approaching the cabin. As they reached the door, Reynolds glanced inside the window. There was no movement, no sign of life. The place looked empty, but something about the scene made her stomach tighten. She signaled her officers to cover the perimeter while she cautiously approached the door. "Lawson, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up," Reynolds called, her voice commanding but calm. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The door creaked open slowly, and standing in the threshold was Samuel Lawson. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic, but there was no sign of surrender. He held something in his hand, a gun, pointed straight at Reynolds. "You don't understand," Lawson said, his voice shaky but defiant. "You don't understand what Nathaniel did to me." Reynolds held her ground, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. "Put the gun down, Lawson. We don't want anyone else to get hurt, but we need to know the truth." Lawson's gaze flickered between Reynolds and the officers behind her. He was calculating, weighing his options, but his expression was a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you know the truth?" Lawson's voice was bitter. "You think Nathaniel was some kind of saint? He lied to everyone, including his own wife. He played us all for fools, and I'm not the one who needs to explain myself." Reynolds felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about, Lawson? What did Nathaniel do to you?" Lawson stepped forward, his hand still gripping the gun. "He promised me, Detective. He promised we'd be together, that he would leave her, leave the church. We had plans, but he couldn't follow through. He refused to leave his wife. He said he couldn't, that it was too dangerous. But I gave him everything, everything, and he threw me away." Reynolds' mind raced. This wasn't just a lover's quarrel. This was a man who had been emotionally manipulated, led to believe that there was a future with Nathaniel West. But when that future didn't come to pass, Lawson's obsession turned deadly. "He didn't want to divorce his wife," Lawson continued, his voice cracking. "He said he loved her too much. But it wasn't enough for me. I couldn't be in the shadows anymore. I couldn't live that lie. I wanted more. I wanted to be his." Reynolds could hear the raw pain in Lawson's words. This was a man who had built his entire life around the false hope of a future with a man he thought loved him. When Nathaniel had refused to leave his wife, when he had refused to commit fully to their relationship, Lawson snapped. "You killed him because he wouldn't leave his wife?" Reynolds asked, her voice softer now, trying to reach the man in front of her. Lawson nodded, his grip on the gun loosening ever so slightly. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, almost as if he were convincing himself. "I just wanted him to feel the same pain I felt. I wanted him to see what he had done to me. But then it all just happened so fast. He was standing there on that altar, in front of everyone, telling them how much he loved her. He lied to them all. He lied to me." As Lawson spoke, the raw emotion in his voice became more evident. His words weren't just about love or betrayal. They were about a man who had become consumed by obsession. He couldn't accept the truth, that Nathaniel had never been his, that their relationship had been nothing more than an escape for Nathaniel, a fleeting indulgence that meant nothing in the face of his real life. Lawson had been living in a fantasy, and when that fantasy crumbled, it pushed him to commit an unforgivable act. Reynolds took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. Samuel, you need to let the gun go. This won't fix anything. You can't undo what you've done, but you can still make this right. For a moment, Lawson hesitated, his eyes filled with conflict. His grip on the gun tightened again, and his breathing quickened. I loved him, Lawson whispered, his voice breaking. I thought he loved me. Reynolds knew she was running out of time. The officers behind her were ready, and they knew that if Lawson made a move, they would have no choice but to subdue him. But in that moment, Reynolds saw something more than just a killer. She saw a man who had been lost, broken by his unrequited love, and driven to madness. She had to act fast. Samuel, listen to me, she said softly, but with authority. I understand the pain you're in, but you don't have to carry this burden anymore. Let us help you. For the first time, Lawson's expression softened. The gun wavered in his hand, and in that brief moment of hesitation, Reynolds seized the opportunity. With a swift motion, she lunged forward, knocking the gun from Lawson's hand and tackling him to the ground. He struggled, but it was over. He was arrested, his fate sealed. As he was led away in handcuffs, Reynolds couldn't help but think of Nathaniel West, of the life he had taken from his wife, his congregation, and most tragically, from Samuel Lawson. It wasn't just a murder, it was a tragedy that had been building for years, fueled by lies, betrayal, and an obsessive love that had spiraled out of control. The case wasn't over, but the truth had finally come to light. And as Reynolds stood in the woods, watching Samuel Lawson being driven away, she knew one thing for certain. No one had won here. Everyone had lost something. The police station was buzzing with activity as Detective Allison Reynolds sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments in the case. Samuel Lawson had been arrested, but the deeper Reynolds dug into the investigation, the more she realized that Lawson wasn't the only one hiding secrets. Pastor Nathaniel West's life wasn't as picture-perfect as it had appeared to the Oakwood community. The affair had been just the beginning. There were other dark corners of Nathaniel's life that had remained hidden until now. Reynolds stared at the case file in front of her. Lawson had confessed to shooting Pastor Nathaniel, but there was still one crucial question that loomed over everything. Why had Nathaniel waited so long to end his relationship with Lawson? Why hadn't he cut ties with the man who had become so obsessed with him? Why did he allow this situation to escalate to the point of murder? There was more to Nathaniel's story, and Reynolds was determined to find out what. She stood up and motioned for Officer Jenkins to join her. He had been instrumental in gathering evidence on Samuel Lawson, and Reynolds needed his help in investigating Nathaniel's life further. Jenkins, I need you to pull everything you can on Pastor Nathaniel, she said. I want to know about his financial records, his personal emails, anything that might reveal his connections outside of his wife and the church. We need to know what he was hiding. Jenkins nodded. Got it, Detective. I'll get started right away. As Jenkins left, Reynolds sat back down and began to sift through the transcripts of Lawson's interrogation. Lawson had been calm, but there was a sense of finality in his confession. He spoke about how Nathaniel had made promises to him, promises that Nathaniel had failed to keep. Lawson had believed that Nathaniel would leave his wife, Sarah, and start a life with him. The fact that Nathaniel had refused to divorce Sarah was the turning point, but there had to be more to it. Lawson's words had hinted at a deeper betrayal, one that went beyond just love and rejection. Then, as Reynolds reread Lawson's statements, one part stood out. Nathaniel lied to everyone, even Sarah. He told me we'd be together, but that wasn't true. He lied to her too, and I wasn't the only one who suffered from it. Reynolds felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Lawson was right. There had been something else, something beyond the affair and the rejected promises of love. She had to figure out what it was. Hours later, Jenkins returned to Reynolds' office with a stack of documents in his hands. I got Nathaniel's personal records, Detective. Some of it's clean, no debts, no criminal activity, but there's a pattern in his financial transactions. He was making regular, large deposits to an account that doesn't match any known church funds. It's tied to a private trust. Reynolds leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. A private trust? What's the connection? I'm not sure yet, Jenkins replied, but I've noticed that the account is linked to several companies, some of which appear to be involved in property investments. There's also one large transaction, over $100,000, made to an anonymous recipient about 6 months ago. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. This was starting to look like something more than just a pastor who had been unfaithful to his wife. There were financial dealings, hidden accounts, and a large sum of money involved. She stood up. I want a full report on that private trust. Find out who owns it, who's been involved with it, and why Nathaniel was making those payments. This isn't just about an affair, it's about something bigger. The next day, Reynolds visited the Oakwood Bank to inquire about Nathaniel's private trust. She spoke with the bank manager, who was hesitant at first, but after showing him a copy of the church's investigation request, he agreed to provide the necessary records. The documents revealed a web of financial transactions tied to several businesses and offshore accounts, all linked to Nathaniel. It seemed that Nathaniel had been secretly funneling money from his position as pastor into a series of questionable investments. The largest sum, over $100,000, had gone to a property development company in the Caribbean, a company that had no clear ownership or legal record. Reynolds felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Nathaniel West, the revered pastor, had been involved in a money laundering scheme. The trust was nothing more than a front for illicit dealings. The more Reynolds dug, the more she realized that the affair with Lawson had been just one of many lies Nathaniel had told. But what did this all have to do with Lawson? Why had he been involved? Was he being used by Nathaniel in the same way he had used others? Reynolds sat at her desk late that night, piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. Nathaniel had been living a double life. He had used his position as a pastor to run illegal investments and hide money, but he had also betrayed Lawson in the worst possible way. Lawson had been part of Nathaniel's schemes, perhaps unknowingly at first, but when Nathaniel had refused to leave his wife and truly commit to their relationship, it had shattered everything. Lawson had been discarded by Nathaniel, just like the many others who had been used in Nathaniel's underhanded dealings. In his final moments, Nathaniel had been caught in the web of lies he had woven, and Lawson had paid the price for it. Lawson had become so obsessed with Nathaniel that when the truth about their relationship came to light, the lies, the betrayals, he had snapped. It was clear now. Nathaniel had built an empire of deceit, using the trust of his congregation, his wife, and even Samuel Lawson for his own gain. But in the end, it had all come crashing down, with a murder in the church where he had once preached about faith and forgiveness. As Reynolds prepared to bring Lawson in for his final questioning, she couldn't help but reflect on the tragedy of it all. Pastor Nathaniel's life had been a perfect illusion, a mask of holiness and virtue, but behind it lay a man who had betrayed everyone who trusted him. The community of Oakwood had been torn apart by this revelation, but there was one thing Reynolds knew for certain: justice would be served. Lawson had acted out of obsession and pain, but Nathaniel West had created the monster that would eventually destroy him. As she left her office and prepared to face Lawson once more, Reynolds knew that this case was far from over. There was still much to uncover, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter how deep the lies went. The truth would come to light, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The evening air was heavy with tension as Detective Allison Reynolds stood at the Oakwood police station, her mind still processing the shocking revelations from the past few days. She had uncovered the depths of Pastor Nathaniel West's lies, his affair, his financial deceit, and the way he had manipulated everyone around him, including Samuel Lawson. But there was still one question that gnawed at her. Why hadn't Nathaniel faced the consequences of his actions sooner? Why had it taken so long for the truth to come to light? The more Reynolds reflected on Lawson's confession and the financial records, the clearer it became. Nathaniel had been a man with everything to lose, and in trying to protect his perfect image, he had destroyed lives along the way. Lawson, a man who had once been deeply in love with Nathaniel, had been betrayed not just emotionally, but financially and spiritually as well. Reynolds had known that Lawson's obsession with Nathaniel had led him to a dangerous breaking point, but the more she thought about it, the more she understood the twisted dynamic between them. Lawson had been left alone with nothing but the shattered remnants of a relationship built on lies. The murder wasn't just about love, it was about betrayal on multiple levels, betrayal that Lawson could never have imagined when he first met Nathaniel. Reynolds' thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at her office door. It was Officer Jenkins, holding a file in his hands. "Detective, I've got an update," he said, stepping into her office. "I just spoke with one of the witnesses who saw Samuel Lawson leave the cabin last night. He mentioned something about a confrontation between Lawson and Nathaniel in the days leading up to the murder." Reynolds leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did he say?" Jenkins handed her the file, which contained a brief statement from the witness. The man, a truck driver who had stopped by the cabin to use the payphone, had overheard part of a heated conversation between Lawson and Nathaniel just days before the murder. According to the witness, Lawson had demanded that Nathaniel leave his wife and fulfill the promises he had made. Nathaniel had refused once again, stating that he couldn't leave his wife because of the church and the community. Lawson, it seemed, had become desperate, pleading with Nathaniel to finally make a decision. Nathaniel had told him that there was no future for them, no future at all, and that it was time for Lawson to move on. The witness added that Lawson had sounded furious, accusing Nathaniel of stringing him along, using him for his own pleasure, and discarding him when he was no longer needed. Reynolds felt a pang of sorrow for Lawson. The man had been emotionally destroyed by Nathaniel's constant rejection, and in his twisted mind, the murder had seemed like the only way to get Nathaniel to see the truth. But Nathaniel's rejection, once again, had been the final straw. So Nathaniel had made it clear that he wasn't leaving Sarah, Reynolds muttered, more to herself than to Jenkins. He had completely shut Lawson out, and it seems like Lawson wasn't willing to accept it. Jenkins nodded. Exactly, and it looks like the confrontation between them escalated from there. Lawson wasn't going to take no for an answer anymore. Reynolds closed the file with a sigh. She could understand Lawson's pain, but nothing justified murder. Lawson had crossed a line from obsession to violence, and it had cost Nathaniel his life. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle that Reynolds needed to investigate. The next day, Reynolds decided it was time to speak with Sarah West, Nathaniel's wife. Sarah had been left in the dark for so long about her husband's betrayal, and now that Nathaniel was dead, she was left with a broken heart and a shattered life. Reynolds met Sarah at the church, where she had been trying to keep herself busy, making arrangements for Nathaniel's funeral. She was sitting in the front pew, her face pale and hollow, staring at the altar where Nathaniel had been killed. "Mrs. West," Reynolds began softly, approaching Sarah with compassion, "I know this is a difficult time for you, but I need to ask you a few questions." Sarah didn't look up at first, but eventually she turned to face the detective. Her eyes were red from crying, and there was a deep sadness in her expression. "Detective, I don't know how much more I can take," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "First, my husband is killed in front of me, and now I'm finding out that everything I knew about my marriage was a lie. I feel like I've been living in a fantasy." Reynolds sat down next to Sarah, her tone gentle but firm. "I understand, Mrs. West, but in order to help bring justice for Nathaniel, we need to understand what was really going on in your marriage. You were married for over 15 years. Did you ever suspect anything? Anything at all about your husband's relationship with Samuel Lawson?" Sarah's face twisted with pain. She shook her head slowly. I never suspected anything. Nathaniel was always so devoted to me, to this church, to our family. I trusted him completely. I never once thought that he could betray me, let alone have an affair." Reynolds looked into Sarah's eyes. She could see the deep hurt there, but there was something else, something Sarah wasn't saying. "Mrs. West, I need you to think back. Was there anything about Nathaniel's behavior that seemed off to you? Any sign that he was hiding something? Or maybe becoming distant?" Sarah sat back, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the pew in front of her. "There were times when he would come home late after church activities. He'd say it was work, but there were moments when I felt like he was shutting me out. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to trust him. I thought I could. But now I realize I should have known." Reynolds could see the conflict in Sarah's eyes. The weight of the betrayal was crushing her, but she was starting to understand the truth. Her husband had been lying to her for years. "It's not your fault," Reynolds said softly. "You couldn't have known. Nathaniel was very good at hiding his secrets." Sarah wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. So Samuel Lawson, he wasn't just some stranger? Reynolds shook her head. He was someone Nathaniel was deeply involved with, and that's why Lawson killed him. He couldn't take being rejected anymore. Nathaniel promised him a life together, but he never followed through. Sarah's face went white as she processed the information. I don't know if I can ever forgive him, she whispered. My husband, the man I loved, was living a lie, and now he's dead, because of his choices. Reynolds stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. We're going to make sure justice is served, Mrs. West, and you'll have the answers you need. As Reynolds walked out of the church, she knew the case was nearing its end. The truth about Nathaniel's secret life had come to light, and Samuel Lawson had confessed to the murder. But the damage had already been done. The lies, the betrayals, and the manipulation had torn apart the West family and shattered the community's trust. In the end, there were no winners. Everyone had lost something. Sarah had lost her husband, Lawson had lost the love he had desperately craved, and the entire congregation had been forced to face the ugly truth about the man they had worshipped. But justice would prevail, and perhaps, in time, healing would begin for those who were left behind. Detective Allison Reynolds stared out the window of her office, the heavy weight of the case pressing on her chest. The investigation into Pastor Nathaniel West's death had taken a toll on her, on everyone involved. The lies, the deception, and the tragedy had left scars that would take years to heal. Sarah West, Nathaniel's wife, had been left in the dark for so long, betrayed by the man she had loved and trusted. But it wasn't just Sarah who had been affected. The entire Oakwood community had been rocked to its core. Nathaniel West had been more than just a pastor. He had been a leader, a figure of authority and respect. And now his secrets had shattered everything. As Reynolds sifted through the final pieces of the investigation, she realized that the truth, while painful, was necessary. But it wasn't just about finding out who killed Nathaniel. It was about understanding why it had happened and what it meant for the people left behind. The following day, Reynolds met with the district attorney, Mark Stevens, to discuss the next steps in the case. Lawson's confession had been straightforward, but the circumstances surrounding Nathaniel's betrayal had left a bitter aftertaste. Stevens had been following the case closely, and now that Lawson was in custody, they needed to figure out how to present the case in court. Detective, we have Lawson's confession, but I'm still not sure if this case is as simple as it seems, Stevens said, pacing around his office. The affair, the financial fraud, the manipulation, there's more at play here than just a lover's murder. Reynolds nodded. I agree. Lawson was deeply hurt, but his actions weren't just about an affair gone wrong. This was about a man who had been lied to for years, emotionally manipulated. Nathaniel's choices led him to this point. Stevens stopped pacing and turned to face her. So what's our strategy here, Detective? Lawson's confession is solid, but how do we prove that Nathaniel's own actions led directly to his death? Reynolds took a deep breath. We need to show that Lawson wasn't just some jilted lover. Nathaniel had built a life of lies, his financial dealings, his affair, and the way he manipulated everyone around him. Lawson didn't just kill Nathaniel because of unrequited love. He killed him because Nathaniel had taken everything from him, his trust, his heart, his future. Stevens thought for a moment before nodding. I see your point. We'll need to frame this as a tragedy that was years in the making. Lawson is the one who pulled the trigger, but Nathaniel's actions pushed him to that point. Reynolds left the district attorney's office feeling a sense of clarity. The case had taken so many unexpected turns, but now with Lawson in custody and the full truth exposed, it was time for the community to face the reality of what had happened. The trial began a few weeks later, and the courtroom was filled with people from Oakwood, members of the church, friends of Nathaniel, and even a few curious onlookers. It was a small town, and everyone had an opinion about what had happened. Some believed Lawson was simply a murderer, driven by jealousy. Others saw him as a victim of Nathaniel's manipulation, a man who had been driven to the edge by betrayal. Reynolds sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the defense and prosecution made their cases. Lawson's lawyer argued that he had been emotionally damaged by the affair and had been subjected to emotional abuse by Nathaniel. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of a man who had been so consumed by his obsession that he had crossed a line from love to violence. As the trial progressed, the truth of Nathaniel's actions came to light. His financial dealings were exposed, as were his lies to Sarah. The church's funds had been misused, funneled into private investments and shell companies. His affair with Lawson had been going on for over a year, and despite promises to Lawson that he would leave his wife, Nathaniel had refused to make good on those promises. The testimony from the prosecution painted Nathaniel as a man who had used his position of power to manipulate those around him. He had played both Sarah and Lawson for fools, promising them futures he had no intention of providing. In the end, it was Nathaniel's refusal to fully commit to Lawson that had led to his death. As the jury deliberated, Reynolds sat in the courtroom, watching the faces of the people who had once revered Nathaniel. Some were tearful, others angry, but all of them had been affected by the man they had trusted. No one had truly known who Nathaniel West had been, and now they were forced to face the ugly truth. It didn't take long for the jury to return with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Lawson had acted in a moment of rage, but the prosecution had successfully argued that his actions were the result of years of manipulation and betrayal. Reynolds felt a strange sense of satisfaction as the verdict was read aloud. Lawson's fate was sealed, but the truth had come to light. The people of Oakwood could now begin to heal, knowing that justice had been served, even if it had come at a heavy cost. A few weeks later, Reynolds visited Sarah West. The trial had been difficult for her, but now that it was over, Sarah was trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She had been left with nothing. Her husband was gone, his reputation destroyed, and she was left to rebuild alone. "Detective," Sarah said softly, her voice tired but resolute, "I don't know how to move on from this. I thought I knew Nathaniel. I thought we had everything, our family, our life together. But now I don't even know who he really was." Reynolds sat beside Sarah, offering her a sympathetic look. "You were deceived, Sarah, and that's not your fault. No one should have to go through what you've been through." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I just don't know how to trust again. I don't know how to let go of the person I thought he was." Reynolds placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's going to take time, but you're stronger than you think. You have the support of the community, and you don't have to go through this alone." Sarah looked at her, a small, grateful smile forming on her lips. "Thank you, Detective. I don't know if I could have gotten through this without you." Reynolds gave her a reassuring nod. "I'm glad I could help, but now it's time for you to focus on yourself. The truth is out, and Nathaniel's actions are no longer yours to carry." As Reynolds left Sarah's home, she couldn't help but reflect on the cost of deception. Nathaniel West had built his life on lies, and in the end, it had cost him everything: his life, his marriage, and the trust of the people who had once admired him. Lawson, too, had paid the price for the betrayal he had endured. And Sarah, though she would never be the same, had the chance to rebuild her life, free from the man who had deceived her. In the end, the truth had come at a steep price, but it had been the only thing that could bring justice and healing to those affected. The people of Oakwood could now begin to move forward, knowing that the darkness had been exposed for all to see. It had been months since the trial, and Oakwood was still trying to recover from the shock waves that had rippled through the town. The once serene and close-knit community now felt fractured, haunted by the revelations of betrayal, deceit, and murder that had rocked its foundation. Pastor Nathaniel West's death had torn apart the lives of those closest to him, and the truth about his double life had left scars that would never fully heal. Detective Allison Reynolds had seen her fair share of heartbreaking cases, but this one had left a deeper impact. The story of Nathaniel's manipulation, the affair with Samuel Lawson, and the devastating consequences of his choices weighed heavily on her. It wasn't just the murder that lingered. It was the lives left in shambles in its wake. The community of Oakwood would never be the same. Sarah West had spent the last few months trying to piece together her life. She had moved out of the family home, seeking refuge with a friend in a nearby town. The funeral for Nathaniel had been a solemn affair, and while Sarah had tried to maintain a sense of composure, the truth about her husband's betrayal had taken a toll on her mental and emotional well-being. Detective Reynolds had continued to check in on Sarah, making sure she had the support she needed. Despite the community's whispers and the judgment that still lingered over her, Sarah had slowly begun to rebuild her life. The first steps were painful, but she was starting to regain a sense of self-worth. Reynolds had also remained in Oakwood, working through the aftermath of the case. The investigation into Nathaniel's finances had uncovered a network of shell companies, money laundering schemes, and other fraudulent activities that had been going on for years. It had been clear that Nathaniel had been using his position as a pastor to hide his corrupt dealings, and the revelation had left the congregation reeling. Many members had lost their faith, while others clung to their beliefs, trying to reconcile the man they had once revered with the criminal he had become. But it wasn't just about Nathaniel's fall from grace. The trial had also exposed the toxic relationship between Lawson and Nathaniel, how it had been built on lies and unfulfilled promises. Samuel Lawson had been sentenced to prison for second-degree murder, and though the jury had recognized the emotional turmoil that had driven him to kill, there was still no excuse for taking a life. Lawson's obsession with Nathaniel had ended in tragedy, and now he would have to live with the consequences of his actions. One crisp morning, Reynolds received a call from Sarah. "Detective," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady, "I've decided to come back to Oakwood." Reynolds was surprised, though she could hear the resolve in Sarah's voice. "Sarah, are you sure? I thought you were still staying with your friend." "I was," Sarah replied, "but it's time to face things. I can't hide from this forever. I need to be here, to take back control of my life." Reynolds smiled. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. Oakwood has its problems, but you don't have to face them alone. I'll be here for you, and I'm sure the community will be too." Sarah returned to Oakwood in early spring, her heart heavy but her mind focused. She had sold the family home and bought a small house on the outskirts of town, away from the church that had once been the center of her life. It wasn't easy to return to the place where so much had fallen apart, but she was determined to rebuild. The first few weeks were the hardest. Sarah spent her days cleaning up the remnants of her old life, sorting through things that had once held meaning, but now felt empty. The photographs, the gifts, the letters from Nathaniel. It all seemed like a distant memory, a time before the truth had shattered everything she thought she knew. But as time passed and Sarah began to reconnect with the community, some of the old church members reached out, offering their apologies and support, while others couldn't look her in the eye, their judgment hanging in the air. But Sarah didn't let it discourage her. She had been through the worst, and she had come out on the other side stronger. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her new home, unpacking boxes, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Detective Reynolds standing on her porch, a warm smile on her face. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing," Reynolds said, stepping inside. "How's the house? Settling in okay?" Sarah nodded, though her smile was tinged with sadness. "It's strange, but I'm getting there. It's going to take time, but I feel like I'm starting over. I'm not sure where I'm going, but I'm going somewhere." Reynolds took a seat across from Sarah. "That's the most important thing. You're moving forward, and you're doing it on your terms." As the two women spoke, Reynolds could see the subtle transformation happening before her eyes. Sarah West was no longer the woman who had stood by her husband's side, blind to the man he had become. She was a woman who had faced the harshest truths and was now taking control of her own narrative. In the months that followed, Oakwood slowly began to heal. The community had been torn apart by Nathaniel's actions. But with time, the town began to rebuild. The church held a memorial for Nathaniel, and while many of the congregation members attended, it was clear that the trust had been broken. Some left, unable to reconcile with the past. Others stayed, hoping for redemption, both for themselves and for the memory of the man they had once called their pastor. But for Sarah, the memorial wasn't about forgiveness. It was about closure. She didn't need to mourn the man Nathaniel had become. She mourned the man he had once been, the husband she had loved, the man who had promised her a life they could build together. That man had never truly existed, and Sarah had to let go of the fantasy in order to move forward. Reynolds kept in touch with Sarah, offering her support and guidance as she navigated the difficult path of rebuilding her life. Sarah had found a job at a local bookstore and had begun volunteering at a nearby shelter, helping others who were facing their own struggles. She was determined to make a difference, to create a new life for herself, and slowly but surely, she was succeeding. As the years passed, Oakwood returned to a semblance of normalcy. The murder of Pastor Nathaniel West had left its scars, but the town had learned to heal. Samuel Lawson, too, had begun serving his prison sentence, though he would forever carry the weight of his actions. But for the community and for Sarah, the true healing had come from within. Reynolds had always believed in the power of truth, no matter how painful it might be. And now, with the case behind her, she knew that Oakwood would eventually move on. But for those who had been affected by Nathaniel's lies, healing would take a lifetime. The cost of deception had been high, but in the end, the truth had set them all free.